Sometimes love finds us when we have nothing left to lose. In the harsh winter of ancient Norway, two sisters named Inga and Solveig are slowly starving to death in their village. When a giant Viking warrior named Ketil Redmark passes through, they whisper a desperate plea: "Stay with us." Everyone knows Ketil as a ruthless fighter who shows no mercy. But something about these women changes him. He stays. He feeds them. He protects them. What starts as an act of kindness grows into something much deeper. The feared warrior who once lived for battle now builds a home. He doesn't choose between the sisters because their bond is unbreakable. Together, they become a family born from survival and trust. But can love really bloom in a land where only the strongest survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the broken palisades of Mørkvoll like the voices of the dead, carrying with it the bitter promise of another endless night. Snow had been falling for 3 days without pause, blanketing what remained of the village in a shroud of white that made even the living look like ghosts. In the dim light of a struggling fire, two women huddled together beneath threadbare woolen cloaks, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of their modest dwelling. Inga pressed her back against the rough timber wall and pulled her younger sister closer, feeling the sharp angles of Solveig's ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. At 28, Inga had already buried a husband and watched her own child waste away during the fever season 2 winters past. Her face bore the weathered lines of someone who had seen too much hardship for her years, yet her eyes still held the fierce protectiveness that had kept them both alive when so many others had perished. Solveig, barely past her 20th year, possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that seemed almost cruel in such harsh circumstances. Her golden hair fell in waves around shoulders that had grown too thin, and her blue eyes, once bright with dreams of someday seeing the great halls of Trondheim, now reflected only the pragmatic hope of surviving until morning. Between her trembling fingers, she clutched a string of wooden prayer beads, each one carved by their mother's hands before the plague took her 3 summers ago. "Tell me again about the harvest feast when father was still alive," Solveig whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's constant moan. Inga closed her eyes, summoning memories that felt like glimpses of another world entirely. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted meat and fresh bread. Honey mead flowed like water, and old Bjorn played his harp until his fingers bled from joy. She paused, swallowing against the hollow ache in her stomach. "Mother wore her blue dress, the one with silver threads, and you danced until your feet were sore." "I remember the taste of butter," Solveig said dreamily, "rich and yellow, melting on warm bread." They fell into silence, each lost in the phantom flavors of abundance. Outside, Mørkvoll continued its slow death. What had once been a thriving settlement of 60 souls now housed fewer than 15. The fields lay barren under snow, the livestock long since slaughtered and consumed, and most of the able-bodied men had left months ago to seek fortune in raids or work in distant lands, promising to return with food and silver. None had come back. The remaining villagers survived on thin gruel made from bark and roots, supplemented by whatever small game the youngest men could trap. But winter had grown too fierce for hunting, and their meager stores dwindled with each passing day. Death had become a patient visitor, claiming the elderly first, then the very young, working its way through the village with methodical precision. Inga knew they had perhaps a week left before their own strength failed completely. She had been rationing their food so carefully that her hands shook constantly now, and Solveig had developed a persistent cough that worried her more than she dared admit. Yet still they clung to life with the stubborn determination of those who had already lost everything except each other. A sharp crack from outside made both women freeze. Footsteps crunched through the snow, heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of someone carrying significant weight. Inga felt her heart hammering as she reached for the rusted kitchen knife that served as their only weapon. Raiders had passed through twice since autumn, taking what little remained each time. "Sisters," a deep voice called from beyond their door, the words accented but clear. "I mean no harm. I seek only shelter from the storm." Inga and Solveig exchanged glances. The voice carried an authority that made the small hairs on their necks stand upright, yet something in its tone suggested weariness rather than threat. Still, they had learned hard lessons about trusting strangers. "We have nothing to steal," Inga called back, proud that her voice remained steady despite her fear. "Move along, stranger." "I ask for nothing but a place to wait out the worst of this wind," the voice replied. "I have food to share, if you will permit me entry." Food. The word hung in the air between them like a prayer half-spoken. Solveig's eyes widened with desperate hope, but Inga held up a warning hand. Too many wolves had learned to wear sheep's clothing in these desperate times. "Show us this food," Inga demanded. "Slide it under the door gap." A moment of silence followed, then the soft thud of something heavy being set in the snow. A piece of dried fish, still wrapped in oiled cloth, appeared beneath their door, more protein than they had seen in a month. "There is more," the voice said quietly, "but I will not force my presence upon you. I will make camp in the lee of your woodpile if you prefer." Inga stared at the fish, her mouth watering involuntarily. Whoever stood outside possessed enough resources to share such food casually. If he meant them harm, he could simply wait for them to weaken further or break down their flimsy door. But if he truly sought only shelter— "What is your name, stranger?" she asked. "I am called Ketil. I come from the northern seas, bound for no particular destination." Ketil. Solveig mouthed the name silently, testing its foreign rhythm. Neither sister recognized it, but that provided little comfort. Vikings from distant lands passed through their region regularly, most seeking easier targets than a dying village. "Are you armed, Ketil, from the northern seas?" "I carry the weapons of a traveler," he admitted without hesitation, "but they remain sheathed while I am your guest." Inga made her decision with the swift calculation of someone who had learned that overthinking often meant starvation. She lifted the heavy wooden bar from their door and pulled it open just wide enough to see their visitor. The man who stood in their doorway seemed carved from the very legends their grandfather used to tell. Ketil Redmark, for surely this was he, though neither sister yet knew his full name, stood nearly 7 feet tall, his massive frame wrapped in a thick bearskin cloak crusted with ice. His beard, russet-colored and streaked with early grey, framed a face that looked as if it had been hewn from granite by an angry god. But it was his eyes that gave Inga pause, pale blue like winter sky, yet holding a depth of weariness that spoke of burdens carried across many seasons. "You are larger than I expected," Inga said simply, stepping back to allow him entry. Ketil ducked through the doorway, his presence immediately transforming their small space. He moved with surprising grace for such a giant, careful not to disturb their meager possessions as he settled near their fire. From beneath his cloak, he produced a leather satchel that contained more food than the sisters had seen in months: dried meat, hard cheese, even a small pot of honey. "I am grateful for your hospitality," he said, his voice gentler now that he could see their gaunt faces clearly. "Please, take what you need." Solveig reached tentatively for a piece of cheese, then looked to her sister for permission. At Inga's nod, she bit into it with careful reverence, tears streaming down her cheeks at the taste of something substantial after so long. "Where do you travel from?" Inga asked, accepting a strip of dried venison while studying their guest carefully. "Many places," Ketil replied, feeding small pieces of wood to their dying fire until it blazed with renewed warmth. "I have sailed from the Orkneys to Constantinople, from the Icelands to the shores of Francia. Lately, I find myself drawn to quieter paths." "Are you fleeing something?" The question escaped before Inga could stop herself. Ketil's hands stilled over the fire. For a moment his eyes held a darkness that made Inga regret her boldness. Then he smiled, an expression that transformed his harsh features into something unexpectedly kind. "Perhaps we are all fleeing something, lady. I seek what many men search for, and few find a place where I might do more good than harm." Solveig spoke up shyly, her voice stronger now that food warmed her belly. "Will you stay until the storm passes?" "If your sister permits it," Ketil replied, looking to Inga with respectful deference that surprised her. Inga found herself studying this strange giant who carried enough wealth to buy their village, yet asked permission to share their humble fire. Every instinct warned her against trust, yet something about his careful movements and patient manner suggested a man more accustomed to protecting than preying upon the vulnerable. "You may stay," she decided, "but we expect no charity beyond tonight. We are not beggars." "No," Ketil agreed solemnly, settling back against the wall with his massive hands resting loosely on his knees. "I can see that you are not." As the storm raged outside, the three of them shared the warmth of the fire and the simple pleasure of food, eaten without the gnawing anxiety of hunger. Ketil spoke little, seeming content to listen as the sisters told him of their village's slow decline and the neighbors who had already succumbed to winter's merciless advance. "Your parents?" he asked gently. "Gone these 3 years past," Inga replied. "The plague took them, along with most of the elders." "I am sorry for your losses," Ketil said, and something in his voice suggested he understood grief intimately. "You have done well to survive this long on your own. We protect each other," Solveig said simply, reaching across to squeeze her sister's hand. "Always." Ketil nodded as if this explained everything worth knowing about them. As the night deepened and the wind finally began to ease, they settled into comfortable silence. Inga found herself stealing glances at their massive guest, wondering what manner of man chose to share his provisions with strangers rather than conserve them for his own journey. When she finally allowed sleep to claim her, wrapped in more warmth than she had felt in months, Inga's last conscious thought was a whispered prayer that morning might bring answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. Dawn broke grey and bitter over Mirkvoll, the storm's fury finally spent, but leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind's howling. Inga woke to find their fire still burning strong. Ketil must have tended it through the night, and the giant himself already moving quietly about their small dwelling, careful not to wake Solveig, who still slept, curled beneath her cloak. "The storm has passed," he said softly when he noticed Inga stirring. "I should continue my journey." Something twisted in Inga's chest at those words, though she could not name what it was. They had known this stranger for barely 12 hours, yet the prospect of returning to their slow starvation felt suddenly unbearable. She sat up, pushing such foolish thoughts away. "Of course," she replied, working to keep her voice neutral. "Thank you for your kindness." Ketil nodded and began gathering his belongings with efficient movements. He paused over his food satchel, then decisively removed half of its contents and placed them near their dwindling stores. "I cannot take these," Inga protested, though her eyes lingered hungrily on the provisions. "They will spoil before I reach the next settlement," Ketil lied smoothly. "It would be wasteful to carry them further." Before Inga could argue, the sharp sound of voices carried through their thin walls, multiple men speaking in low, urgent tones, and one voice rising above the others in what sounded like anger. Ketil's entire demeanor changed instantly, his casual movements becoming predatory stillness as he cocked his head to listen. "Raiders," Inga whispered, her blood turning to ice. "They come for whatever the storm might have left." Solveig woke at the sound of her sister's fear, immediately alert despite her exhaustion. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the crunch of boots through snow and the occasional clash of metal against metal. Through the gaps in their walls, they could see shapes moving between the buildings, at least 6 men, all armed. "Stay here," Ketil commanded quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Do not come out. no matter what you hear. You cannot face 6 men alone, Inga protested, but Ketil was already moving toward the door. For the first time, she saw him touch the long weapon that hung at his side, an ancient war axe, whose blade seemed to drink in what little light filtered through their dwelling. Even in the dim interior, she could see strange runes carved into its handle, and something about the weapon made her skin crawl with instinctive dread. Bloodsong has tasted the life of more than 6 men, Ketil said simply, though whether he spoke to them or to the axe itself, Inga could not tell. We will not trouble you long. He stepped outside before either sister could respond, leaving them to huddle together in terrified silence. Through the walls they heard his voice ring out across the village square, deceptively calm, but carrying clearly in the morning air. "Good morning, travelers. A harsh night for camping?" A chorus of rough laughter answered him. "Look here, brothers," called a voice thick with accent. "The storm blew us a lost sheep." "I am no sheep," Ketil replied mildly, "merely a man seeking passage through your lands." "Our lands?" Another voice, this one edged with mockery. "What tribute do you offer for safe passage, Thermation, Minervesev, for Massabers? Lost sheep?" Inga pressed her eye to a gap between the logs and felt her breath catch. The raiders were lean and hungry-looking, their clothes patched and weapons well used. But it was their leader who made her hands tremble, a scarred man with dead eyes, who carried himself with the casual cruelty of one who had killed often and enjoyed it. "I offer you the opportunity to continue breathing," Ketil said conversationally. "It seems a fair trade." The leader's face darkened with anger. "You think yourself clever, giant? There are 6 of us, and 1 of you." "6 of you," Ketil agreed. "But you are not warriors. You are carrion birds, feeding on the weak and dying." His voice never rose, but something in its tone made the raiders shift uneasily. "I am Ketil Redmark. Perhaps you have heard the name." Even through the wall, Inga could hear the sharp intake of breath from the raiders. The leader's bravado faltered, his eyes darting to his companions for support that was no longer there. "The Bloodmark himself," one of the raiders whispered. "Thor's hammer, Einar, we should leave." "Stand firm," the leader Einar snarled, though his voice carried less certainty now. "Legend or not, he is still 1 man." "Then come and learn what 1 man can accomplish," Ketil invited. The sound of metal sliding from leather was unmistakable, Bloodsong being drawn from its sheath. What followed lasted perhaps 30 heartbeats, though it felt like an eternity to the sisters pressed against the wall. The sound of combat erupted outside, not the chaotic clash of many weapons, but the methodical rhythm of a master craftsman at work. Steel rang against steel, men cried out in pain and terror, and through it all came the whistle of Bloodsong cutting through winter air. Then silence. Inga forced herself to look through the gap again, and immediately wished she had not. 4 of the raiders lay motionless in the snow, their blood steaming in the cold air. The 5th was crawling away, leaving a red trail behind him, while Einar knelt in the blood-stained slush with his sword fallen from nerveless fingers. Ketil stood over him, completely unmarked by the battle, Bloodsong resting casually across his shoulder. His breathing was not even labored. "You have a choice," Ketil told the kneeling man. "You can die here, or you can carry word to others like yourself. Tell them that Mirkful is under my protection now. Tell them what happens to those who prey upon the weak when Ketil Redmark is watching." Einar nodded frantically, his face white with terror. Yes, I will tell them." "See that you do." Ketil stepped aside, allowing the raider to scramble to his feet and flee after his wounded companion. Neither looked back. When Ketil finally returned to their dwelling, he seemed somehow different, not the gentle giant who had shared their fire, but something older and far more dangerous. He cleaned Bloodsong with methodical care before sheathing it, his movements precise and practiced. "Are they gone?" Solveig asked in a small voice. "They will not return," Ketil assured her, his tone gentling as he focused on the sisters. Nor will others of their kind, once word spreads. Inga stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who had carefully tended their fire with the deadly force she had just witnessed. You could have left before they arrived. Why did you stay to fight? Ketil was quiet for a long moment, gazing into their fire as if seeking answers in its flames. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. Because I have seen too many villages like yours stripped bare by wolves in human form. Because I have been such a wolf myself. He looked directly at Inga, his pale eyes holding hers. And because no one should have to whisper, "Stay with us," to empty air. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that Inga was only beginning to grasp. Outside, she could hear other villagers emerging from their hiding places, their voices filled with wonder and relief as they discovered the raiders' bodies. "You heard us," Solveig said wonderingly. "Last night when I heard," Ketil confirmed, "and I find myself reluctant to leave you to face winter alone." Inga felt something crack open in her chest, some long frozen part of her heart that she had thought lost forever. This giant, this legend made flesh, was offering them what she had never dared hope for: protection, companionship, perhaps even a future beyond mere survival. "The village will need leadership now," she said carefully, testing the waters of possibility. "Old Björn died last week, and there is no one left with the strength to organize our defenses." "I am no leader of villages," Ketil replied. "I know only war and wandering." "Then perhaps it is time you learned something new," Inga suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. Ketil looked between the sisters, Inga with her fierce determination and Solveig with her quiet hope, and something in his expression shifted. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would change all their lives. "If you will have me, I will stay until spring. But know this, I am not the man I was in the tales. That man did things that would give you nightmares. I seek to be better." "Then we will learn together," Inga said simply. Outside, the people of Mirkvold began to whisper of miracles and guardian spirits. Inside the small dwelling, 3 unlikely souls began the delicate work of building trust from the ruins of their separate despairs. The storm had passed, but something far more profound was just beginning. 3 days after the raiders fell, Mirkvold began to stir with a life it had not known for months. Word of Ketil's protection spread through the remaining households like warmth from a rekindled hearth. And for the first time since the harsh winter began, children dared to play outside their doors. Ketil had claimed no formal authority over the village, yet somehow he had become its beating heart. Each morning, he made rounds to check on the surviving families, bringing small portions of his seemingly inexhaustible food stores to those most in need. In the afternoons, he worked alongside the younger men to reinforce the damaged palisades and shore up weakened buildings against the continuing cold. "He moves like the work is worship," Solveig observed to her sister as they watched Ketil split firewood in the courtyard outside their dwelling. Despite his massive size, every stroke of his axe fell with precision, each log splitting cleanly down its center. The rhythm was almost hypnotic, steady, patient, inexorable. Inga nodded, kneading dough for their first real bread in weeks. The iron cooking pot that Ketil had procured from his seemingly magical supplies sat over their fire, filling their home with the rich scent of barley stew. Such simple abundance felt like a dream after months of thin gruel and gnawing hunger. "He finds peace in useful labor," Inga replied. "I think he has not known much peace in his life." It was true. In the quiet moments when Ketil thought himself unobserved, his face took on a quality of profound weariness that spoke of burdens carried across many seasons. Yet when the children approached him tentatively at first, then with growing boldness, his weathered features transformed with gentle warmth. "Tell us about the sea beasts," young Astrid had demanded that morning. tugging at Ketil's cloak with the fearless persistence of a child too young to understand the concept of legendary warriors. Ketil had settled cross-legged in the snow, making himself smaller and less intimidating as he spun tales of krakens and whale roads, his deep voice painting pictures of adventures beyond their small world. The children had listened with rapt attention, their thin faces bright with wonder, while their parents watched from doorways with expressions of cautious hope. He could have any haul he desired, Inga mused, watching steam rise from their pot. Any Jarl would welcome the Bloodmark as an honoured guest, yet he chooses to mend our broken fences and tell stories to hungry children. Solveig moved to the small loom in the corner of their dwelling, another gift from Ketil's mysterious stores, this one a beautifully crafted piece that had clearly known the hands of a master weaver. The frame was cracked along one side, the wood split by some long-ago impact, but it still held thread true and steady. "Perhaps that is why," she said quietly, beginning to work the damaged shuttle through the warp threads. "Perhaps he grows tired of halls filled with men who care only for the glory in his reputation." The sound of approaching footsteps made both sisters look up. Ketil appeared in their doorway, his arms full of fresh-cut timber and his beard glittering with frost. Behind him came Eric, one of the few young men who had remained in Mirkvoll, his face bright with something approaching hero worship. "The main gate post was more damaged than we thought," Ketil reported, setting down his burden with care. "It will need complete replacement before another storm tests it. There is good oak in the forest beyond the fields," Eric offered eagerly. "I could show you where the best trees grow." Ketil nodded gravely, treating the young man's suggestion with the same respect he might give to a seasoned warrior's counsel. "Your knowledge of the local timber will be valuable. We will go at first light." Eric beamed and hurried off to prepare, leaving the three of them alone. Ketil settled beside their fire, accepting a bowl of stew from Inga with quiet gratitude. "You have made that boy happier than he has been in months," Inga observed. "He lost his father in the spring raids and has been trying to fill a man's role ever since." "He has good instincts," Ketil replied between careful spoonfuls. "With proper guidance, he will become a formidable protector for your village." "Will you provide that guidance?" Solveig asked from her loom, her fingers never pausing in their steady work. Ketil was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if reading omens in its dancing flames. "I am not certain I am the right man to guide anyone toward righteousness," he said finally. "My own path has been complicated." "All paths worth walking are complicated," Inga said firmly. "The simple ones lead nowhere of value." Something in her tone made Ketil look up, meeting her eyes across the fire. For a heartbeat, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibility. Then Solveig's shuttle caught on the loom's damaged frame, breaking the moment. "Here, let me help," Ketil offered, rising to examine the broken wood. His large hands moved over the crack with surprising gentleness, testing the strength of the joint. "This can be mended properly, a little careful work with the right tools." "You know weaving?" Solveig asked, surprised. "My mother was a weaver before she wed my father," Ketil explained, his voice taking on a distant quality. "She taught me that creation requires as much skill as destruction, perhaps more." Inga felt something warm unfold in her chest at this glimpse into Ketil's past. The feared warrior speaking softly of his mother's hands, teaching him to value the delicate work of making rather than breaking. "What became of her?" Solveig asked, gently. Ketil's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She died when I was young. Fever took her, as it takes so many." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "Before the end, she made me promise to use my strength to protect those who could not protect themselves. It is a promise I have not always kept." "But you are keeping it now," Inga pointed out. "Now, yes," Ketil agreed. "Perhaps it is not too late to become the man she hoped I would be." The conversation was interrupted by voices outside. Eric had returned with two other young men, their excitement evident as they discussed plans for the morning's timber expedition. But beneath their enthusiasm, Inga could hear something else: respect. These young men spoke of Ketil not with the fearful awe his reputation commanded, but with the warm regard earned through daily kindness and patient instruction. As evening settled over Mirkvoll, the three of them fell into a comfortable routine that was becoming familiar. Ketil mended and reinforced whatever needed attention, his massive hands surprisingly adept at delicate work. Solveig wove by firelight, creating cloth that would soon become warm clothing for the village children. Inga prepared their meals and managed their supplies with the careful efficiency of one who had learned to make little go far. It was domestic, peaceful, nothing like the grand adventures sung by skalds in the great halls, yet somehow more meaningful than all the glory those songs described. "Tomorrow I will speak with the widow Ragnhild about better organizing our food stores," Inga said as they prepared for sleep. "If more refugees arrive before spring, we will need a proper distribution system. And I will work with Eric to select our timber," Ketil agreed. "The boy has excellent judgment for one so young." "I should be able to finish the first of the new cloaks by week's end," Solveig added. "Little Astrid needs something warmer than those rags she has been wearing." They spoke like a family planning their shared future, though none of them dared acknowledge it aloud. Outside, the wind carried the sounds of a village settling into sleep without fear, children's laughter, the comfortable murmur of adult conversation, the ordinary sounds of people who felt safe in their own homes. As Inga drifted towards sleep, listening to Ketil's steady breathing and her sister's soft sighs, she found herself daring to hope for something she had thought lost forever, a future that held more than mere survival. A week into Ketil's stay, the first thaw came like an unexpected gift. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, and patches of dark earth began to show through the snow like promises of spring still months away. The sound of melting ice filled the air with a music that spoke of renewal and hope. Inga found herself sitting beside the fire with a bone needle and thread, mending a tear in Ketil's woolen undershirt. The fabric was well made but showed the wear of long travel, and she worked carefully to reinforce the weakened seams. It was intimate work, handling the clothing that touched his skin, imagining the powerful frame it covered, yet it felt as natural as breathing. "You do not need to tend my clothes," Ketil protested gently from where he sat, sharpening his eating knife. "I am capable of such tasks myself." "I know you are," Inga replied, not looking up from her careful stitches. "But 4 hands work faster than 2, and winter will not wait for our individual pride." Solveig smiled from her place at the loom, where she worked thread with steady rhythm. "Besides, Inga enjoys having something useful to occupy her hands. She has always been one to mend what is broken." "I am not certain all things can be mended," Ketil said quietly, testing the edge of his blade against his thumb. "Perhaps not," Inga agreed, finally meeting his eyes across the fire. "But most tears can be strengthened if one knows where to place the stitches." They fell into comfortable silence, each absorbed in their tasks. The domesticity of the moment struck Inga with unexpected force, how easily they had settled into this pattern of shared labor and quiet companionship. 3 people who had been strangers a week ago now moved around each other with the unconscious choreography of a family. The peace was broken by voices outside, not urgent or fearful, but carrying the weight of serious discussion. Ketil rose immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward Bloodsong before he caught himself and let it fall. "Visitors," he said simply, "but not raiders. The voices are too calm." Through their walls came the sound of approaching footsteps, followed by a respectful knock. "Ketil Redmark?" called a voice, formal but not hostile. "I am Gunnar Eriksson, from the settlement of Ravnholt. I would speak with you, if you will permit it." Ketil exchanged glances with the sisters before answering. "Enter and be welcome, Gunnar Eriksson." The man who ducked through their doorway was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His clothes were travel-stained but well-made, and he carried himself with the confidence of one accustomed to command. Two younger men followed him, obviously guards, though they kept their weapons sheathed. "Lord Ketil," Gunnar began formally, then stopped as he took in the humble domestic scene before him. The legendary warrior sitting by a simple fire, mending clothes being sewn by village women, sharing space with the easy familiarity of long companionship. Forgive me. I had expected to find you differently situated. "I am exactly where I choose to be," Ketil replied calmly. "What brings you to Mørkvold, Gunnar Eriksson?" Gunnar seemed to gather himself, remembering his purpose. "I come with an offer from Jarl Magnus of Ravenholt. He would have you join his warband for the spring raids against the Frankish coast. The promised share would make you wealthy beyond counting, and your reputation would ensure the highest position of honor among his warriors." Inga felt her breath catch. Such an offer represented everything that made men seek the Viking path: wealth, glory, and the chance to carve one's name into legend. For a warrior of Ketil's standing, it was the kind of opportunity that came perhaps once in a lifetime. "The Jarl is generous," Ketil said neutrally. "What manner of raids does he plan?" "Coastal monasteries mostly," Gunnar replied, warming to his subject. "Rich pickings and minimal resistance. The monks have grown soft in their peace, and their treasures are said to rival those of kings. We would take their gold and silver, perhaps some slaves for the markets in Dublin." Inga saw something flicker in Ketil's eyes, a shadow of the man he had once been, perhaps, or a glimpse of the darkness he carried. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "I am honored by the Jarl's confidence," Ketil said carefully, "but I find myself committed to other duties at present." Gunnar's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Other duties? What duties could compare to such an opportunity?" Ketil gestured around their modest dwelling. "The duties of a man who has given his word to protect those who cannot protect themselves. These peasants," Gunnar's voice held poorly concealed contempt. "Lord Ketil, your talents are wasted on such small concerns. Think of the glory that awaits. Songs will be sung of your deeds for generations." "Songs have already been sung of my deeds," Ketil replied, and now his voice carried a harder edge. "I find I prefer the sound of children's laughter to the praises of skalds." Solveig's shuttle had gone still in her hands, and Inga found herself holding her breath. The moment felt balanced on a knife's edge, Ketil's past calling to him through Gunnar's offer, while his present sat quietly watching by the fire. "The Jarl will not be pleased to hear his offer refused," Gunnar warned. "He has been counting on your participation in his plans." "Then the Jarl planned poorly," Ketil said simply. "I am no man's to command, and my choices are my own to make." Gunnar studied Ketil for a long moment, clearly trying to understand what had happened to the legendary warrior. His gaze took in the mended clothes, the shared meal preparations, the comfortable intimacy of three people who had built something precious from nothing. "Very well," he said finally. "I will carry your words back to Jarl Magnus. But no, opportunities like this do not come twice. If you change your mind before the ships sail with the spring tide, you will find a place waiting for you." "I will remember your words," Ketil promised, rising to see his visitors out. After Gunnar and his men had gone, the dwelling felt somehow smaller and more precious. Inga resumed her, mending with hands that trembled slightly, while Solveig's shuttle began to move again in measured strokes. "Do you regret it?" Inga asked quietly, not looking up from her work. "Refusing such wealth and honor?" Ketil settled back beside the fire, his movements deliberate and calm. "I have known wealth and honor, lady. They are cold companions on winter nights." He paused, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "I find myself drawn to warmer company these days." Solveig looked up from her loom, her blue eyes bright with something that might have been relief. "Will other Jarls come calling? Will they try to lure you away with promises of glory?" "Perhaps," Ketil admitted, The raiding season stirs men's blood when winter begins to break, but I have made my choice. He looked between the sisters, his pale eyes holding steady resolve. I told you I would stay until spring. I meant what I said. As evening settled over them, Inga found herself thinking about the man who had just walked away from a fortune to sit by their humble fire. The choice said more about his character than any song or legend ever could. Outside, the sound of dripping water continued, each drop marking time toward an uncertain future. But inside their small dwelling, 3 people sat in comfortable silence, bound together by something more valuable than gold or glory, the simple miracle of being truly seen and chosen. Winter's grip tightened again 2 weeks after Gunnar's visit, bringing with it a cold so fierce that even the heartiest villagers rarely ventured outside. The brief thaw had been a cruel tease, leaving everyone more aware of their vulnerabilities as ice formed thick on the water barrels and frost painted intricate patterns on the inside of their walls. Ketil stood before the village's meagre storehouse, tallying their remaining supplies with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on accurate counting. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Even with his contributions and careful rationing, they had perhaps 3 weeks of food left before the spectre of starvation returned to claim the weakest among them. "How many mouths?" asked Ragnhild, the widow who had taken charge of food distribution with the fierce efficiency of someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. 14 adults, 6 children, Ketil replied, marking tallies on a piece of birch bark with a charcoal stick. "But young Thorstein grows sicker each day, and the baby Astrid carries may not see spring if her strength fails." Ragnhild nodded grimly. She was a practical woman who had buried 3 children of her own and knew the arithmetic of winter survival. "The silver arm ring you spoke of, how much might it bring in trade?" Ketil touched the heavy silver band that encircled his left arm, a piece of warrior's wealth that had travelled with him from the northern seas. It was beautiful work, inscribed with runes that told of victories in distant lands, and worth more than the entire village had seen in years. "Enough," he said simply. "Eric the trader should reach Hedeby within a fortnight if the weather holds. Silver buys grain even in winter, and grain means life. You would trade away such wealth for us?" Ragnhild's voice held wonder rather than gratitude. She was too practical a woman to waste time on pretty words when survival was at stake. But she understood the magnitude of what he offered. "Silver is useful only if there are people left alive to spend it," Ketil replied. He removed the arm ring with careful deliberation, feeling its weight in his palm. "This has value only because men agree it does. The lives it might save have value because they simply are." Ragnhild accepted the ring with reverent hands, her weathered fingers tracing the intricate metalwork. "The children will remember this kindness when they are grown. Songs will be made of your generosity." "I care nothing for songs," Ketil said quietly. "I care that the children live long enough to make them." As they spoke, Solveig approached through the ankle-deep snow, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air. She carried a steaming bowl covered with cloth, their daily offering of hot food for the village watch, a tradition that had begun without discussion and continued through collective understanding that small comforts mattered greatly when larger ones were scarce. "The soup is ready," she told them, her cheeks flushed pink with cold. "Inga sends word that she expects you both before it grows cold." Ragnhild smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern features. "Your sister mothers the entire village now. Even those of us old enough to be her grandmother find ourselves obeying when she speaks of proper nutrition and warm clothing." It was true. In the weeks since Ketil's arrival, Inga had naturally assumed a role that was part healer, part organizer, part stern taskmaster. She moved through the village each day like a general surveying her troops, noting who needed extra food, whose dwelling required repairs, which children showed signs of the cough that could turn deadly in winter's grip. "She has always been thus," Solveig said with fond pride. Even as a child, she gathered wounded birds and nursing them back to strength. Some people are born to mend what is broken. And what of you? Ketil asked as they walked toward the dwelling. What were you born to do? Solveig considered the question seriously, her blue eyes thoughtful. I was born to see beauty even in dark places, I think. To remember that joy exists even when it seems lost. She gestured toward the ice-covered branches overhead, where the setting sun turned frost into diamonds. To remind others that winter always ends, even when it feels eternal. They entered their dwelling to find Inga tending 3 different pots over a fire that blazed with unusual warmth. She had somehow acquired additional fuel, perhaps through trade, perhaps through the village's collective gratitude, and the small space felt almost tropical after the bitter cold outside. Perfect timing, Inga announced without looking up from her stirring. The bread is ready, the stew wants only a few more minutes, and I have managed something approaching butter from the cream that Eric's cow still provides. Ketil felt something tighten in his chest at the scene. This woman, who had been slowly starving just weeks ago, now presiding over abundance like a queen in her hall. The transformation spoke to more than mere access to resources. It reflected the deep satisfaction of someone finally able to use her gifts for their intended purpose. You work magic with simple ingredients, he observed, settling onto the bench she had somehow procured for their table. No magic, Inga replied, ladling stew into wooden bowls. Simply the knowledge that food prepared with care nourishes more than the body. She met his eyes across the table. Love makes everything taste better. Even the humblest meal becomes a feast when shared with those who matter. The word hung in the air between them, love spoken so casually yet carrying the weight of acknowledgement. For a moment, none of them moved, the implications settling like snow on still water. Then Solveig laughed, breaking the tension with the musical sound that had brightened their evenings since childhood. Listen to us, speaking philosophy over soup, like learned scholars in some great library. Why should scholars have exclusive rights to wisdom? Ketil asked seriously. The most important truths are usually learned around kitchen fires, not in halls of learning. They ate in comfortable conversation, discussing plans for the village's continued survival and improvement. Ketil described his ideas for better fortifications. Inga shared her concerns about the health of their most vulnerable members, and Solveig spoke of the clothing projects that would help everyone endure what remained of winter's assault. Spring feels possible now, Solveig said as they prepared for sleep. For the first time in months, I can imagine warmth returning. Spring will come, Ketil agreed, banking the fire for the night. But even if it did not, we have built something here that winter cannot touch. Later, as they settled into their sleeping furs, Inga found herself listening to the quiet sounds of the village around them. Children's voices from nearby dwellings, the murmur of adults making plans for tomorrow, the ordinary sounds of people who felt secure enough to think beyond mere survival. Ketil lay a respectful distance away, but she was intensely aware of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth that seemed to radiate from his large frame, the sense of safety that surrounded him like an invisible wall. For the first time since her husband's death, Inga allowed herself to imagine a future that included partnership, companionship, perhaps even love. The thought should have frightened her with its implications, but instead it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the banked fire. Outside, winter continued its siege, but inside their small sanctuary, 3 hearts began the delicate work of opening to possibilities they had never dared consider. The silver arm ring brought more than grain from Hedeby. It purchased hope itself in the form of Eric, the trader's heavily laden sledge. Word spread through Mirkvoll like fire through dry grass as the merchant's arrival was announced, and even the most stoic villagers allowed themselves to smile as sacks of barley and dried fish were unloaded in the village square. But it was not just food that Eric had brought. As Ketil helped transfer the supplies to their storehouse, the trader pulled him aside with the careful manner of someone bearing sensitive information. "There is talk in the trading towns," Eric said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Word has spread of your presence here, and not all who speak your name do so with friendly intent." Ketil's hands stilled on the sack he was lifting. "What manner of talk?" "Your former war band grows restless without their champion," Eric explained, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "Their new raids have gone poorly, 2 ships lost to storms, another captured by Frankish forces. Some say you cursed them when you left." "I cursed no one," Ketil replied grimly, "but neither did I leave them with my blessing. Their leader, Ragnar Grimson, speaks of retrieving what he calls his stolen property. He claims you owe blood debt for your abandonment." Eric's weathered face creased with worry. "Such men do not forget grudges, nor do they accept losses easily." Ketil nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities and preparations. He had known this day might come. His former life would not release its grip without a struggle. How many sail with him now? Perhaps 30 warriors, though their loyalty grows thin with each failed venture. Still, 30 is enough to overwhelm a village like this, especially if they come with vengeance in their hearts. That evening, Ketil sat in their dwelling with a wooden chest open before him, revealing contents that made both sisters catch their breath. Gold arm rings, silver brooches set with precious stones, coins from a dozen different lands, wealth enough to buy a small kingdom, all carefully wrapped and hidden beneath the chest's false bottom. "This is what I truly am," Ketil said quietly, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame. "Not the gentle protector you see now, but a man who accumulated such treasure through blood and fire." Inga reached out slowly, lifting a gold brooch worked in the shape of a coiled serpent. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but she could feel the weight of its history in her palms, this beautiful thing born from violence and loss. "Where did these come from?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "Monasteries burned, villages raided, ships taken on the open sea," Ketil replied with brutal honesty. "Each piece represents someone's life disrupted, someone's dreams destroyed. I told myself it was the way of the world, that strength took what it could, and weakness deserved its fate." Solveig moved to sit beside him, her hand coming to rest gently on his massive shoulder. "But you do not believe that now?" "I have not believed it for years," Ketil admitted. "Yet I continued the raiding because it was all I knew, all I was good for. Each treasure felt heavier than the last, until the weight of them threatened to drown me." "Is that why you left your war band?" Inga asked, setting the brooch carefully back in its place. "I left because I looked into the eyes of a young mother as my men burned her home, and I saw my own mother staring back at me," Ketil said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In that moment, I understood that I had become the very thing she taught me to stand against." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable but contemplative, each of them processing the weight of his confession. Outside, wind howled through the village, but inside their dwelling, 3 souls grappled with questions of redemption and the possibility of transformation. "What will you do with it?" Solveig asked finally, gesturing toward the treasure. "Use it to protect what matters," Ketil replied. "This wealth can hire mercenaries, buy weapons, purchase safe passage for the village if Ragnar comes calling. Blood money put to better purpose than the taking of more blood." Inga felt her heart swell with something deeper than admiration. This was a man willing to use his dark past to build a brighter future, to turn weapons of destruction into tools of protection. The moral complexity of it did not escape her, but neither did the profound courage it required. "You speak of buying protection," she said carefully, "but what of the protection you already provide? What of the choice you have made to stand with us?" Ketil's pale eyes met hers across the firelight, and she saw vulnerability there that legends never captured. "I speak of it because I fear my presence may bring more danger than safety. If Ragnar comes for me, all of you will suffer for my choices." "Then we will suffer together," Inga said firmly. "You did not choose us lightly, nor did we choose you without understanding the risks." "She speaks truth," Solveig added, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "We have tasted what life could be with you in it. We will not surrender that gift to fear of what might come." Ketil looked between them. These two remarkable women who had seen his darkest secrets and still chose to stand beside him. Something shifted in his expression, a wall crumbling, perhaps, or a door finally opening to let light into long, shadowed places. "I have spent so many years running from my past that I forgot it might be possible to run towards something instead," he said softly. "You have given me that gift, a future worth protecting instead of a history worth escaping." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken promises and acknowledged truths. Then Solveig smiled, her face bright with the joy that had always been her gift to share. "Then let us protect it together," she said simply, "whatever comes." As they prepared for sleep that night, the treasure chest remained open beside their fire, no longer a burden of shame, but a resource for building the life they had chosen to share. The gold caught the firelight and threw dancing shadows on the walls, beautiful and terrible and full of possibility. Inga lay listening to the quiet sounds of their breathing, acutely aware of the trust that now bound them together. They had seen each other's deepest truths, her grief and determination, Solveig's resilience and hope, Ketil's guilt and fierce protective love, and found that truth only made their connection stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, possibly including the confrontation with Ketil's violent past that they all knew was coming. But tonight, they were together, they were warm, and they had chosen each other with eyes wide open to both the darkness and the light. Outside, winter continued its assault on the world, but inside their small sanctuary, love grew stronger than fear, and hope proved more powerful than the weight of old sins. The runestone fragment arrived 3 days later, carried by a half-frozen messenger who collapsed at their gates more dead than alive. Eric and the other young men brought him to Inga immediately, recognizing that his survival might depend on her healing skills. As Inga worked to warm the stranger's blood and force broth between his blue lips, the man's fingers clutched desperately at something wrapped in oiled cloth. Even in his delirium, he would not release whatever he carried, mumbling words in a dialect none of them could fully understand. "He keeps saying bloodmark and prophecy," Solveig observed, helping her sister tend to their unexpected patient. "And something that sounds like the price of kings." Ketil stood in the doorway, his face grave as he watched the messenger's struggle for consciousness. Something about the man's presence disturbed him deeply, though he could not name what it was. When their patient finally opened his eyes and saw Ketil's massive frame, he struggled to sit upright with desperate urgency. "Ketil Redmark," the man gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I carry words from the seeress of Birka. She sent me to find you before the ice breaks." "I know no seeress in Birka," Ketil replied. But he moved closer despite his wariness. "What words could she have for me?" With trembling hands, the messenger unwrapped his precious burden, revealing a piece of grey stone covered in runes so ancient that they seemed to writhe in the firelight. The fragment was roughly the size of a man's palm, broken from some larger monument, and the markings carved into its surface radiated an almost palpable sense of age and power. "She said you would need to see the truth of your birth before the blood debt comes calling," the messenger whispered. "She said the gods have been waiting for you to understand." Ketil's face had gone white as fresh snow. He reached for the stone with hands that shook almost imperceptibly, turning it toward the firelight to read the ancient script. As his eyes moved over the runes, his expression shifted from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "What does it say?" Inga asked quietly, sensing that whatever message the stone carried would change everything. Ketil was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the carved symbols, as if hoping they might rearrange themselves into different words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man whose entire understanding of himself had just crumbled. It speaks of a child born under the wolf moon, marked by Odin for a purpose beyond war, he said slowly. A child whose true father was not the raider who raised him, but a king whose bloodline carries both blessing and curse. A king? Solveig breathed. You are of royal blood? According to this, my mother was not the weaver's wife I believed her to be, but a thrall taken from the court of King Harald Bluetooth, Ketil continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through the implications. She bore a child in secret, a child whose father's identity she never revealed, even under torture. The messenger struggled to speak again, his strength nearly spent. The seeress, she said, to tell you the blood of kings carries the power to unite or to destroy. Your choice will determine which path the North follows. Inga felt the world shifting around them like ice breaking up in spring. Everything they thought they knew about Ketil, his humble origins, his reasons for wandering, even his capacity for both violence and gentleness, suddenly took on new meaning. But there is more, Ketil said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper as he continued reading. The stone speaks of a prophecy made at my birth. It says that the bastard prince will face a choice between the throne he never knew he could claim and the love he never thought he deserved. What choice? Inga managed to ask, though part of her feared the answer. Ketil's eyes met hers across the fire, and she saw in them a pain so deep it took her breath away. It says that I must choose between claiming my birthright as Harald's heir and remaining with those who have shown me what it means to be truly home. But it warns that I cannot have both, that attempting to hold on to love while grasping for a crown will destroy everything I seek to protect. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, wind howled through the village, but inside their dwelling, three hearts grappled with the weight of destiny suddenly thrust upon them. A throne, Solveig said finally, her voice small but steady. You could be a king. I could claim to be a king, Ketil corrected grimly. But such claims require proof, and proof requires war. Harald Bluetooth has legitimate sons who would not welcome a bastard brother's challenge to their inheritance. The messenger made one final effort to speak, his voice fading like a guttering candle. The seeress said to remind you that kings are made, not born, and that some thrones are worth less than a single moment of true belonging. With those words, the stranger's eyes closed, and his breathing settled into the deep rhythm of exhaustion finally overcome. Inga continued to tend him, but her mind was reeling with the implications of what they had learned. The raiding season approaches, Ketil said quietly, staring into the fire as if seeing visions in its flames. Word of this prophecy will spread like wildfire once it reaches the right ears. Men will come seeking to use me as a banner for their own ambitions. Others will come to eliminate a potential threat to the established order. And your former war band? Inga asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Ragnar Grimson will see this as his path to power, Ketil replied with bitter certainty. If he can control the bastard prince, he can claim legitimacy for his raids and perhaps even challenge Harald directly. He will come not just for revenge now, but for the crown he thinks I can win for him. The weight of their situation settled over them like a physical burden. What had begun as a simple story of survival and growing love had suddenly become entangled with the fate of kingdoms and the ambitions of men who cared nothing for the quiet happiness they had built. What will you do? Solveig asked, her voice barely audible. Ketil looked at the runestone fragment in his hands, then at the two women who had become the center of his world. The firelight played across his weathered features, highlighting the pain and determination that warred in his expression. I will do what I have always done, he said finally. I will protect what matters most to me, regardless of the cost. He set the stone carefully aside and reached across the fire to take each sister's hand in his own. But I need you both to understand something by staying with me. You risk becoming targets in a war that extends far beyond our small village. If my enemies cannot reach me directly, they will strike at those I love. Then we must be prepared to defend ourselves, Inga said firmly, her fingers tightening around his. And each other. The prophecy spoke of a choice, Solveig added softly. But perhaps the choice is not between love and power. Perhaps it is between letting fear decide our future or choosing to fight for the life we want to build. Ketil smiled then, the first genuine expression of joy they had seen from him since the messenger's arrival. How did two village women become wiser than all the sages and seers I have known? We learned from watching you, Inga replied simply. You showed us that the most important battles are fought not for glory or gold, but for the right to choose who we become. As they settled the unconscious messenger in a warm corner and prepared for sleep, the runestone fragment lay between them like a promise and a threat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight they remained united in their determination to face whatever came together. Outside, the wind carried whispers of change on its icy breath, but inside their small dwelling, 3 hearts beat with the steady rhythm of love that had chosen to be stronger than fear. Spring's first breath came early that year, bringing with it the sound Ketil had been dreading, the distant rhythm of war drums carried on the morning wind. He stood atop Mørkvold's rebuilt watchtower, his eyes scanning the horizon, where smoke columns rose like dark prayers against the pale sky. Ragnar Grimson was coming, and he was bringing more than just his war band. How many? Eric asked from below, his young face tight with the kind of fear that comes from truly understanding danger. Too many to count from here, Ketil replied, though his practiced eye had already noted the telltale signs, at least 50 warriors, possibly more, moving in organized formation, rather than the loose raiding parties he might have expected. They have allies, other bands seeking to claim a piece of whatever prize they think I represent. 3 days had passed since the messenger's recovery, during which word of the prophecy had somehow leaked beyond their walls. Perhaps the half-frozen man had spoken to others before reaching Mørkvold, or perhaps the gods themselves had whispered the secret to those who needed to hear it. Either way, the carefully guarded peace of their winter sanctuary was about to be shattered. Inga climbed the ladder to join them, her face calm despite the approaching threat. In her hands, she carried the ceremonial wedding rings that Ketil had forged during the darkest hours of the previous night, simple bands of iron hammered with the steady rhythm of a man working through fear and doubt. The villagers are ready, she reported quietly. Those who can fight have taken positions behind the new palisades. The children and elderly are hidden in the root cellars, as you instructed. Ketil accepted the rings from her with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Such simple things, rough, iron circles that had cost him nothing but time and effort, yet they represented the most important decision of his life. "Are you certain?" he asked, his pale eyes searching her face. "Once these are exchanged, there will be no hiding what you mean to me. My enemies will know exactly how to hurt me most." "We have been certain since the night you chose to stay," Inga replied firmly. "The rings merely make visible what has always been true." Solveig appeared at the tower's edge, having climbed up behind her sister. In her hands, she carried the signal horn that Ketil had given to the village, watch an ancient instrument carved from walrus ivory and bound with silver wire. Its voice could carry across vast distances, and today it would serve as their call to unity. "The people are asking what they should know," Solveig said softly. "About the prophecy, about your bloodline, about what this battle might mean for the kingdom." Ketil was quiet for a moment, weighing the burden of truth against the comfort of ignorance. Below them, the villagers moved with purposeful determination, these ordinary people who had chosen to stand with him, despite understanding so little about the forces arrayed against them. "Tell them the truth," he decided. "Tell them that I am the bastard son of a dead king, and that ambitious men seek to use me as a stepping stone to power. Tell them that by standing with me, they risk becoming part of a war that could reshape the North." "And tell them this," Inga added, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, that regardless of bloodlines or prophecies, you are the man who chose to protect them when no protection existed. You are the man who traded his wealth for their survival and his freedom for their safety. Tell them, Solveig continued, that royal blood or common blood, you are their champion by choice rather than birth, and that makes your claim to their loyalty stronger than any throne could ever be. The sincerity in their voices, the absolute conviction with which they spoke of him, struck Ketil like a physical blow. Here were two women who had seen him at his darkest and most vulnerable, who knew the weight of blood on his hands and the burden of guilt he carried, yet still they spoke of him as if he were something precious rather than merely dangerous. "How did I become so fortunate?" he murmured, more to himself than to them. "By learning to see yourself as we see you," Inga replied simply. "By choosing to become the man you were meant to be, rather than the weapon others tried to make you." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their moment of tenderness. A rider was approaching under a banner of truce, one of Ragnar's men, no doubt, come to deliver terms that would be unacceptable but necessary to hear. "Stay here," Ketil instructed, though he knew the words were futile. Neither sister had shown any inclination to hide from danger when their loved ones were threatened. The messenger was a grizzled warrior Ketil recognized from his raiding days, Olaf Ironbeard, a man whose loyalty could be bought, but whose word, once given, held firm as mountain stone. He dismounted with the careful respect of someone who understood he stood on hostile ground. "Ketil Redmark," Olaf called formally. "I bring words from Ragnar Grimson, rightful leader of the Stormwolf warband and your sworn brother in arms." "I acknowledge no brotherhood with Ragnar," Ketil replied, his voice carrying clearly across the village square, where nervous faces peered from doorways and arrow slits. "But I will hear his words. He offers you terms," Olaf continued, unrolling a piece of parchment with the ceremonial gravity befitting serious negotiations. "Return to the warband as his second in command. Support his claim to leadership when he presses for recognition of your royal heritage. Share in the wealth and power that will flow from uniting the scattered raiding clans under one banner. And in return, your village will be spared. Your companions will be granted safe passage to any destination of their choosing, along with enough silver to ensure comfortable lives far from the reach of politics and war." The offer was exactly what Ketil had expected, generous enough to sound reasonable, yet calculated to separate him from everything that mattered. Ragnar understood that threats alone might drive Ketil to desperate resistance, but the promise of safety for those he loved might prove more persuasive than any sword. "And if I refuse these generous terms?" Ketil asked, though he already knew the answer. Olaf's weathered face grew grim. "Then Ragnar will take by force what should be given freely. The village will burn, its people will be sold in the slave markets of Dublin, and your defiance will serve as an example to others who might question his authority." "I see." Ketil was quiet for a moment, appearing to consider options that he had already rejected in his heart. "Tell Ragnar that I will give him my answer at sunset. Until then, let no warrior of his approach within arrow range of our walls. He will honor the truce until then," Olaf promised, remounting his horse. "But choose wisely, old friend. The forces gathered against you are too great for any village to withstand, no matter how bravely its defenders might fight." After the messenger had departed, Ketil gathered the village leaders in the main hall, such as it was, merely the largest dwelling with benches enough for a dozen people to sit in comfort. The faces that looked back at him reflected a mixture of fear, determination, and trust that humbled him profoundly. "You have heard the terms," he said without preamble. "I will not insult your intelligence by pretending the choice is simple or the odds favorable. If I go with them, you will likely be safe, but forever separated from whatever life we might have built together. If I stay, we face a battle we cannot win through strength of arms alone. Then we must win it through something else," declared Ragnhild firmly. "Through cunning, perhaps, or through the kind of courage that makes legends? What do you propose? Eric asked, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. Ketil smiled then, the expression transforming his harsh features into something that spoke of hope rather than grim determination. From his belt, he drew the ivory signal horn, its carved surface gleaming in the dim light. "We remind them that some things are worth more than kingdoms," he said quietly, "and we show them what happens when free people choose to stand together against those who would make them slaves." As the afternoon wore on, Mirkvoll transformed itself into something unprecedented, a village preparing not just to resist conquest, but to make a statement about the nature of courage and the power of chosen family. Every person who could hold a weapon took up arms, while those too young or old to fight prepared in other ways. Children too small to understand the danger gathered flowers that would be woven into crowns not for celebration, but as symbols of the beauty worth protecting. Elders shared stories of ancestors who had faced impossible odds and prevailed through unity rather than individual heroism. And in the small dwelling that had become the heart of their community, 3 people prepared to exchange vows that would either be their last act as free individuals or their first as something entirely new, a family forged not by blood or law, but by the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other above all other considerations. As sunset approached and the time for decision drew near, Ketil lifted Solveig's hand and placed one of the simple iron rings upon her finger, then did the same for Inga. When they placed the 3rd ring upon his finger in return, the ceremony felt more sacred than any ritual conducted in great halls before assembled nobles. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together." "Together," they agreed. And in that word lay all the defiance and hope and stubborn love that would carry them through the darkness ahead. The sun hung low on the horizon when Ketil lifted the signal horn to his lips, its ivory surface warm against his skin despite the evening chill. The note that emerged was deep and resonant, carrying across the valley like the voice of ancient gods, calling their children to witness something extraordinary. From every corner of Mirkvoll came the response, doors opening, voices rising in unified answer, the sound of a community that had chosen defiance over surrender. Men and women emerged from their dwellings carrying whatever weapons they possessed, their faces set with the kind of determination that comes from protecting something precious rather than seeking something distant. Ragnar's warband had positioned themselves on the ridge overlooking the village, their shields and spears creating a wall of iron that caught the dying light like the scales of some great serpent. 50 warriors at least, all seasoned fighters, who had followed the promise of royal plunder across the cold seas to this unlikely battlefield. "Look at them," Ragnar called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Farmers and fishermen playing at war, while their betters wait to claim what is rightfully ours." But Ketil saw something different as he surveyed the villagers around him. He saw Eric standing tall beside the rebuilt gate, the young man's fishing spear transformed into a weapon of defense. He saw Ragnhild organizing the women into teams for tending wounded and fighting fires, her weathered face fierce with protective fury. He saw children old enough to understand danger, helping their elders find secure positions, their eyes bright with the kind of courage that comes from absolute trust in their protectors. "They think to cow us with numbers," Inga observed quietly, taking her place at Ketil's left shoulder. She had armed herself with a long knife and a determination that made her more formidable than many warriors twice her size. "Numbers alone do not win battles," Solveig added from his right, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She held a bow, one of the few in the village with arrows fletched by her own careful work. "Hearts united in purpose can overcome forces that stand divided by greed." Ketil felt a surge of pride so intense it threatened to overwhelm him. These women, these people, had chosen to stand with him not because of royal blood or prophetic destiny, but because they believed in the life they were building together. That belief transformed a small village's desperate defense into something approaching the sacred. Ketil Redmark, Ragnar's voice boomed across the space between them. The sun sets, and with it your time for choosing. Will you come freely, or must we take you by force? Ketil stepped forward, positioning himself where both sides could see and hear him clearly. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute conviction. "I choose to remain with those who know my true worth," he called back. "I choose the family I have built over the crown I never wanted. I choose love over power, and I choose to fight for the right to make that choice freely." A murmur ran through Ragnar's forces, surprise, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. They had expected to face a cornered animal, desperate and unpredictable. Instead, they found themselves confronting a man who had deliberately chosen his ground and his allies. "Then you choose death, for all who stand with you," Ragnar snarled, raising his sword high. "Men of the Storm Wolf, take the village, bring me Ketil's head, and claim whatever treasure you find for your own." The charge began as a thunderous roar of voices and the clash of weapons against shields, but it faltered almost immediately as the attackers discovered what Ketil and his people had spent the afternoon preparing. The approaches to Mørkvoll had been transformed into a maze of obstacles, hidden pits, tangled rope lines, carefully positioned stones that turned sure footing into treacherous uncertainty. "Now!" Ketil shouted, and the signal horn's voice rose again, this time answered by the whistle of arrows and the sharp crack of sling stones finding their marks. The villagers had positioned themselves with the strategic wisdom of people who knew every stone and shadow of their homeland, turning familiar ground into an advantage that numbers could not easily overcome. The first wave of attackers stumbled and fell back, their confidence shaken by resistance far more organized than they had anticipated. But Ragnar was no fool. He quickly regrouped his forces, sending smaller groups to probe for weaknesses while keeping his main strength in reserve. "They test our defenses," Inga observed, notching another arrow with practiced efficiency. "Looking for the weak point where they can break through. Then we make sure they find no weakness," Ketil replied, hefting bloodsong in hands that had never felt steadier. "We show them what happens when free people fight for something worth preserving." As darkness began to fall over the battlefield, both sides settled into the deadly dance of siege and resistance. But something had already changed in the balance of the conflict. The attackers had come, expecting easy victory, and instead found themselves facing an enemy that fought not from desperation, but from hope. The first phase of the battle belonged to Mørkvoll, but Ketil knew this was only the beginning. Ragnar had come too far and staked too much on this venture to accept defeat so easily. When dawn came, the real test would begin. Dawn brought with it a sight that chilled every defender's heart, reinforcements streaming over the ridge to join Ragnar's forces. Word of the battle had spread through the night, drawing opportunists and glory-seekers who smelled royal blood and easy plunder. What had been 50 warriors was now close to 100, their war cries echoing across the valley like the voices of hungry wolves. But the night had also brought unexpected allies to Mørkvoll. Eric the trader had returned with a dozen armed men mercenaries who owed him debts or favors, fighters who had grown tired of serving ambitious jarls and chose instead to stand with ordinary people defending their homes. It was a small addition to their forces, but it spoke to something larger than mere numbers. "They come from greed," Eric explained to Ketil as they surveyed the approaching host. "We stand for something better. That difference will matter more than you might think." The final assault began with Ragnar himself leading the charge, his broken sword raised high as he sought to carve a path directly to his former lieutenant. This was no longer about capturing Ketil alive. The bastard prince's defiance had transformed the conflict into something personal, a test of wills that could only end with one leader standing over the other's body. "Face me, Oathbreaker!" Ragnar roared as he crashed through the outer defenses, his warriors spreading like floodwater around the village's desperate defenders. Face the man you abandoned and learn the price of betrayal. Ketil met him in the village square, Bloodsong singing through the morning air to clash against Ragnar's blade with a sound like thunder. Around them, the battle raged with the fury of men fighting for incompatible visions of what strength should serve. But even as steel rang against steel, both warriors knew this confrontation would not be decided by sword skill alone. Ragnar fought with the desperate fury of a man whose dreams of power were crumbling around him, while Ketil fought with the steady purpose of someone defending everything that gave life meaning. "You could have been a king," Ragnar snarled between strikes, his blade seeking gaps in Ketil's defense. "Instead, you choose to die protecting peasants who will forget your name before your body grows cold. Better to be remembered with love by few than feared by many," Ketil replied, his massive frame moving with deadly grace as Bloodsong traced patterns in the air that spoke of years spent perfecting the art of war. Better to die protecting what matters than live serving what does not. The tide of battle swirled around them, but gradually the defenders' superior knowledge of terrain and motivation began to tell. The attackers had expected easy victory, not a prolonged fight against people willing to die for their homes. Doubt crept into their ranks like winter fog, slowing their advance and weakening their resolve. It was then that Ragnar made his fatal mistake. Seeing his forces begin to waver, seeing his grand dreams of royal conquest turning to ash around him, he attempted to strike at Ketil through those he loved. Breaking away from their personal combat, Ragnar charged toward where Inga and Solveig stood, defending the approach to the main hall. "If I cannot have the prince," he screamed, "then I will take what the prince loves." Ketil's response was immediate and terrible. Bloodsong left his hands like a thunderbolt, spinning through the air to take Ragnar in the chest and drive him to the ground with the force of divine judgment. The war leader's blade shattered against the earth, its pieces scattered like the fragments of his ambitions. "No," Ketil said quietly, standing over his fallen enemy. The sight of their leader's death broke what remained of the attacker's will. Those who could fled toward the ridge, abandoning weapons and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the wrath of a man who had proved that some things were indeed worth more than kingdoms. But Ketil felt no triumph as he reclaimed Bloodsong from Ragnar's still form. He looked at the ancient weapon, this instrument of death that had served him for so many years, and saw in its rune-carved blade a symbol of everything he was finally ready to leave behind. With deliberate ceremony, he raised the war axe high above his head and brought it down against the largest stone in the village square. The ancient weapon, forged by master smiths and blessed by forgotten gods, shattered like ice before the spring thaw. "Let this be the end of Ketil Redmark," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the battlefield. "Let all who hear these words know that the man who bore that name died here, and in his place stands one who chooses to build rather than destroy." The broken pieces of Bloodsong caught the morning light like scattered stars, beautiful in their destruction. Around the square, villagers and defenders alike stood in awed silence. Understanding that they had witnessed more than a battle's end, they had seen the birth of something entirely new. As the last of Ragnar's forces disappeared over the ridge, Ketil turned to find Inga and Solveig waiting for him, their faces bright with love and relief and pride. The prophecy had spoken of choosing between love and power, but in the end, the choice had been simpler than anyone imagined. He had chosen to become himself. 3 months later, Myrkvoll bloomed with a life that would have seemed impossible during those dark winter days when 2 starving sisters had whispered their desperate plea to a passing giant. The village had not merely survived, it had transformed into something unprecedented in the northern lands, a community where strength served protection rather than conquest. Ketil stood at the edge of the newly expanded fields, watching Eric and the other young men prepare the soil for spring planting. In his hands he held a small leather pouch filled with seeds, barley, rye, and even some precious wheat that Eric the trader had procured from the southern kingdoms. These planted seeds represented more than just the promise of autumn harvest. They were symbols of a future built through patient cultivation rather than violent taking. "The soil is rich here," Solveig observed, joining him at the field's edge. Her belly showed the gentle curve of early pregnancy, and her face glowed with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Mother always said that good things grow where love has been planted." "Your mother was a wise woman," Ketil replied, slipping his arm around her shoulders with the easy affection that had become natural between all three of them. "I wish I could have known her." "You would have liked each other," Inga said, approaching from the village with their midday meal balanced in her arms. Her own pregnancy was further along. She would likely give birth before the first snow fell, and she moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo. She had your gift for seeing people's true worth beneath whatever masks they wore. They settled in the shade of an ancient oak tree, sharing bread and cheese, and the kind of companionable silence that speaks of deep understanding. Around them, Mirkful hummed with purposeful activity. New families had arrived throughout the spring, refugees from harsher settlements, young couples seeking a place where merit mattered more than bloodline, even a few former warriors who had grown weary of the raiding life and wanted to try building something instead. "Any word from the king's messengers?" Solveig asked, though her tone suggested the answer mattered less than it might have months ago. "Harold Bluetooth's representatives came and went last week," Ketil replied with a slight smile. "They offered formal recognition of my legitimacy, a place at court, even a small kingdom of my own, if I would swear fealty to the crown." "And your response?" "I told them I already rule a kingdom," Ketil said simply. "One measured not in conquered lands, but in the trust freely given by people who choose to call this place home." It was true. Mirkful had evolved into something that defied easy categorization, not quite a typical village, not quite a traditional kingdom, but a community bound together by shared values rather than blood or conquest. Ketil led not through divine right or military might, but through the daily demonstration that leadership meant service to others rather than dominion over them. "The children have been asking when you will tell them the story of the great battle," Inga mentioned, watching young Astrid chase butterflies through the tall grass. "They love hearing about their protector's mighty victory." "I will tell them a different story," Ketil decided. "About a man who learned that the greatest victory is not defeating your enemies, but discovering that you no longer need them to define who you are." As afternoon settled into evening, the three of them made their way back to the dwelling that had become the heart of their unconventional family. It was larger now. Ketil's carpentry skills and the village's willing labor had expanded it to accommodate their growing household and the occasional important guest who sought audience with the man, some still called the bastard, prince. But titles meant little within these walls. Here, Ketil was simply husband and father-to-be, a man who split firewood and told bedtime stories with equal dedication. Here, Inga was the healer and organizer whose gentle authority kept their community functioning smoothly. Here, Solveig was the keeper of beauty and joy, whose laughter could brighten the darkest day and whose optimism reminded them all that tomorrow held infinite possibilities. Their evening meal was joined by several of the village children, as had become tradition. Little Astrid, now healthy and bright-eyed, demanded to hear about the sea monsters that Ketil claimed to have seen in his wandering days. Eric's younger brother wanted to know about the best wood for making arrows. Even shy young Bjorn had overcome his fear enough to ask tentative questions about the proper care of weapons. "Why did you choose to stay with us instead of becoming a king?" Astrid asked, with the directness that only children possess. Ketil considered the question seriously, as he did all inquiries from the young. "Because kings are surrounded by people who need them for what they can provide: wealth, protection, favor, but families are surrounded by people who love them for who they are, not what they possess." "Besides," Solveig added with a smile, he discovered that being a husband and father is much more difficult than being a warrior. Warriors only have to face their enemies once in a while. Husbands and fathers face their families every day. The children giggled at this, though the adults understood the deeper truth in her words. Building a life together required a different kind of courage than facing battle, the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to choose love, even when it seemed impractical or impossible. As the children returned to their own homes and the three adults prepared for sleep, Ketil found himself thinking about the prophecy that had seemed so momentous just months ago. The seeress had spoken of choosing between love and power, as if they were mutually exclusive forces that could never coexist. But sitting here with his wives, feeling the gentle movements of his unborn children, surrounded by a community that flourished under his protection, Ketil understood that the prophecy had been wrong about one crucial thing. He had not chosen love over power. He had discovered that love was the greatest power of all. Outside their windows, Merkfol settled into peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new growth, new possibilities, and the continued presence of those who had proven that some bonds are stronger than fate itself.